I think I think it's good intro music.
I think it's great intro music. I like the music. I had no complaint
I
about
think
that at all.
I think hopefully later when people hear that sound that they know what it is.
First of all, congratulations. You know, I know on this podcast you're known as Tobin. I have a hard time saying that, so I am going to say Bryan. Bryan, congratulations. The 99th episode, and you are right now in the process of putting together episode 100. How does it feel?
Uh, I think it feels kind of an achievement in itself to do 100 episodes of like anything. Because I mean, if you look at it from a TV kind of perspective, five seasons is around 100 episodes. I know with like people watching a lot of Netflix, there's like a whole joke of like it has to have so many episodes, otherwise I'm not watching. I'm not watching one season, not watching two seasons. Got to have so many episodes max. So I feel like to achieve 100, you're kind of at the point where even if like people weren't paying attention before, they're kind of like, oh well, it's got 100 episodes. Yeah, it's something that I can binge listen to or binge watch now. So yeah, so for binge people out there, I guess I'm doing okay.
Well, and you know what? I think it's a good point. It is an accomplishment, whether it's television or radio or whatever. I mean, a lot of podcasts never get that far. I mean, 100 episodes in, and some amazing guests along the way, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But did you think you'd get here? I mean, tell me a little bit about how this started. I mean, how you got started with the podcasting.
So like at the time, it's kind of different or gets in between two different years, which I think is interesting when you think of any time when someone's doing a startup project, whether again movie, TV, music, even. You hear them when they say about an album or something like, "Oh, it took 2 or 3 years in the process," which is kind of the sense of a podcast. I was probably one of these people at Carleton that always felt like, oh, I'm going to start my own radio show one day or my own podcast, but always just one of those like getting there, not going to do it. I believe at Loyalist, I did sports journalism at Loyalist, and my roommate happened to be from Ottawa, still a good friend with him today, Bradley Hart. And we were in sports journalism, and I just remember thinking like, I'm getting kind of tired of the lot of sports answers that you're getting from athletes. And I was like, be interested to actually sit down with them and have a conversation. So he kind of came up with a sports podcast. And it was just, you're just sitting there at an apartment with your buddy, just going back and forth of the ideas, but never really coming to anything. And then I remember going back to Ottawa to go to Algonquin College, and this was in your second year. I'd had an internship with Global Toronto from Newfoundland. I'm going to be in there with interns from Ryerson, from different universities, University of Toronto, and they're coming to you going, okay, so pitch us an idea. And you're like, I'm not from this area. I don't know what I'm going to pitch to you. So it just wasn't a great fit. But I remember going back to Algonquin, and they're like, you need something of an internship to graduate from this program. So I remember sitting down with a teacher, kind of brainstorming, going back and forth, and just getting shut down. And at one, I think, it just came to the point where I said, you know what, I'm just going to go in this back booth, and I'm just going to interview Colin Mockery, the Arkells. And he just looked at me and said, good luck. But the way he said it was just enough to kind of piss you off. And I was like, it was just supposed to be a saying, like to just tell him like, you're asking me to do this and I'm not going to be able to do that. So kind of lower the standard. But when he just kind of gave you that little good luck, I was like, oh, that's it. You lit a fire. I've got to go do it. So at first, I think I came to him with just a sports show. Me and my buddies talking about Ottawa sports, and he just instantly kind of gave it the Simon no. And I said, okay. I reached out to Colin Mockery, Max Kerman from the Arkells, their PR, and it was the Junos. The Junos were in Ottawa that year. So I said, oh, it'd be a great opportunity. And to my surprise, with nothing really to go on, you can't give them sample material. They said yes. And I think the very first one I interviewed before these two was Jimmy Rankin, because I grew up East Coast, loved Jimmy Rankin. Remember when we actually went across Canada because you were going out to BC, and one of the songs coming right off the ferry was a Tim McGraw song and a Jimmy Rankin song. And I just thought, isn't that what Nova Scotia's going to do? They're going to get Jimmy Rankin on the radio. They want you to embrace the culture, which I thought was great. And I just reached out to him thinking nothing of it. And he said, sure, I'd love to. Like, no, like, give me some sample material, what's your reach? And I was like, okay, like, I'm a student here and whatever, like, don't expect like a big TMZ out of it. But he said, no, man, I'd love to do it. And I think it encouraged me more because there's, when you're interviewing anyone and you're just starting off, you're going to have hiccups. But I liked at the end of the interview, he kind of gave you a little bit more confidence because he said, no, man, like the interview was great. Anytime someone wants to chat with me about my career and they're very interested, I got all the time in the world for them. So I said, okay, as long as you're genuine, you're a little bit interested in what they're doing, in this case, a lot interested for Jimmy Rankin, they'll be okay. And as long as you can present yourself doing a good interview, being, again, genuine, things will go okay. So I just kind of went through the hardships of it a little bit, but yeah, we got there, I think.
So that's a great story. So first of all, Jimmy Rankin, Atlantic Canadian, doesn't surprise me at all that he's, open and friendly and willing to help out a fellow Atlantic Canadian for sure. But what about the sorry, I've lost my train of thought. We will have to edit this somewhere along the line. What? Jesus. Oh, sorry. Okay, now I know. You said about your professor, like it almost sounds like it was a, he didn't think you could do it, so you just decided you were going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I think at that point, like, to be fair, and again, I'm a pretty open person, pretty honest person, can be, the catch-22. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. That's why I wear 22 as a hockey number, soccer number, just so people know right out base.
I actually didn't know that myself, why you're so big on the number 22. I guess I'm learning something here myself.
But it's just like, I guess coming from Carleton, from, even seeing kind of yourself graduate, like, we're probably 12, 13 years difference. And then there's another brother in between there that's 10 years. So like, the joke that it's going around sometimes like having a second family, or like two of my parents. So like, I always thought once you graduated university or college, it was pretty much like, the life is your oyster. Like, you can go achieve anything. You're going to get a job as soon as you come out with anything. And then I found it, like, it was a learning curve. I found coming from Carleton, I remember saying to people, I'm done, I'm finished, this is great. But there was no jobs popping up. And it turned out you need actual experience. It's no good to be book smart, which ironically enough, a lot of my friends told me when we were playing street hockey, you're book smart, Bryan, but you're not like street smart. And I was like, okay, so is this what street smart is pretty much in this type of world? So I went to do a little bit more background in sports journalism because that's what I wanted to do. And it just came to the point, in coming back to what the teacher said of pushing you, I had teacher push me at Loyalist, basically saying, Bryan, this isn't your best work. You could do better. And when you get by with someone just kind of giving you 100 or saying, that's it, you think, all right, I'm at my peak. But when a teacher kind of pushes you to go a bit further or see something that you don't see in yourself, I think that kind of, you either take it two ways. You basically say, that's their opinion. Okay, I'm going to continue to do what I do. Or you basically say, oh no, I'm going to prove that person wrong. Because if they're seeing something that you don't see, like, prove it to them. So in like a bit of a long-winded answer there, I think that's what it just came down to, is anytime someone pushes me, I feel like I have to either achieve it or at least show them that I am capable of doing it. Especially if I'm representing, not that I'm out there on the streets holding up a sign for it, but as a person with a disability, that always kind of feels like I've got an uphill battle. It's just to kind of show it like, listen, there's a way to make it even, but you kind of find a way to make that playing ground even.
All right, so let's talk a bit about that for a minute. The disability, because you don't talk a lot about that on the podcast.
No.
I think you've mentioned it periodically, but not very often. So tell me a bit, what is the disability you have? Like, explain to your listeners what that actually is.
So the disability I have is like Sturge-Weber syndrome. I kind of learn about it more and more, kind of, I guess, yearly. I'm not going to say every day because that would be kind of bland, just like every day searching up on a disability. And then I'm one of those people that if I see something that would just make you paranoid. So I learn more about it, I guess, year by year. But I guess first starting off, I believed it was like a branch off epilepsy, which may be a little bit more easier for people to understand. It's more or less I get weakness in my right arm and right leg. And I'm fully aware the whole time. I can tell people, like, to be honest, there are times that we're in interviews like this that it could happen. And I might get a little bit off. Like I might just kind of move around a little bit more. Or I might outright say to an interview, if we're doing a video, like, listen, I'm going through something right now. Give me like 5 or 10 minutes to recuperate. But I could still probably power through the interview. But to me, it's trying to be a perfectionist. It's like, okay, this is kind of being a distraction right now. So let's kind of put a pause on it. But that's essentially what it is. And like I have a port wine birthmark. It's not maybe as visible as it used to be. But yeah, that's kind of what it is. It's just like the arm and leg go numb. I've had it since I was a baby. You're born with it. And it's just, just being mindful of it, being observant of what you do to try to not cause things. Like it's supposed to be like lack of sleep, stress, lack of food that causes it. So it's keeping up with that stuff. But for the most part, I don't really talk about it in the podcast because I don't want to come across as a disability podcast. Now, if someone comes on, they bring up about a disability, or the interview is kind of prone to this person has a disability, but look at what they overcome, then yes, I will mention it. But it's not like this running gag or running bit where you mention it every episode, because if you're talking to, say, a Peter Mansbridge and he's talking about his news, do you really want to come up and be like, totally relate to that, Peter? Actually, as a person with a disability, and then he'd just be like, I don't know where you're coming up with that. We didn't even touch on that topic. Why are you bringing this up?
So it's kind of, it's hard to sort of bring into, regular conversation. But the fact is that, I mean, you downplay the disability a little bit. I mean, the fact is it's Sturge-Weber syndrome is a brain disorder, which is what causes those seizures that you're describing. And even when you were much younger than that, I mean, when you were 11 or 12, you had a stroke. I mean, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So I think that was kind of my first kind of mind-blown experience. And I mean, a joke aside, I mean, it's all kind of laughing at it now, but I just remember, going out with your bike, riding your bike. And yes, you'd get like what every kid experiences summer. You go down a hill and break an arm and you're like, okay, grade 4 is ruined for me now because I've broken my arm going down a bike. But I was just going around a bend and I remember I think it was like my arm, or no, it was my leg that wasn't just pedaling. And, I think it's like a pretty brand new bike. And if you know William Tobin, you don't just leave new things lying around, especially a couple of blocks away. So I struggled to bring that bike home with one arm and one leg, kind of carrying it. And, when you come through the door and you're saying my arm and leg are numb, like, you don't know what's going on. For all I know, maybe my parents did, or they're just learning about it in a way too, because most times what a seizure or whatever was at the time when I was younger was just staring off into space and someone shouting at you and you didn't realize it. And again, as a kid, you don't know that stuff because you're just kind of growing up with it. So yeah, and I think the first thing as a joke, and I'm not trying to make it sound like it's mean, but it's just humor. I remember my parents' first thing was, well, geez, Bryan, like you carried the bike home. You could have left the bike. And I was like, okay, so I got a arm and leg here that aren't clearly working, but you're basically going to give me a little bit of shit about not taking a bike home. But it's just jokes aside. But, that's where I kind of got the experience of the stroke. And I remember being in the hospital for, I think it was like a few days, I believe, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that. To me, it probably felt longer.
You were actually in a week.
Yeah.
You're actually in a week. You went in on a Friday night. It was Labor Day weekend, and your condition kind of got worse to the point where within a few hours, you had full paralysis on half of your body, where even your facial expression, you couldn't move that side of your face. So it was actually quite scary for everybody in the family. Now, I mean, the good news was that within a week or 2 weeks, you slowly started to get things back, and you were able to recuperate most of that. I think you still have a little bit of weakness in your right side, but you're generally pretty good, right?
Yeah. It's not.
Yeah. So,
It's like the left side is still always dominant and always was. Which is, I guess, the good part about it is like it's not affecting how I write or read or like kick a soccer ball or anything in sports. Like, yeah, it's a little bit slower, but it's not like I was predominantly right-handed. I was always a lefty. So yeah, like in terms of that's my kind of knowledge of what my disability is. And like I said, there's times every couple of years or a year that you'll learn something a little bit new about it, whether it's just growing up and it changes over time. Like at one point I remember in high school, it used to be I could sense it coming and everything would go white and you just have to lie down. But I don't really get that as much. And then now I get the leg and arm. But I feel like as you get older and you're aware of this, it's helpful for like employers or people that you come across, like your buddies, if you're at a game and you're like, listen, I need to take like 10 minutes, something's happening. But as long as you're kind of conscious of it the whole time, people are not as scared of it. And I think that's a good mentality, I guess, to have on myself is if I know, like if I'm aware, okay, I've had this done before, it's not a big issue. So that's my experience of it. But again, it could change over time. But at this point, I'm kind of, if that's the most that happens, then I think I'm doing okay.
no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we never knew when you were a kid, and you're right. There's a 13-year. You're the youngest. I'm the oldest, and we have a middle brother as well. And like there's 13 years between us, and so we didn't know how you were going to come out of that. We didn't know what impact this would have. But the other piece of this is you haven't always been open really about the disability. We never talked a lot about it when you were a kid. And then, in the last few years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, you've sort of wanted to learn more about it and have been more open about it. What changed in that time for you?
I think it comes from like two different spectrums. I kind of tried, and sometimes you can fall off the rails with this when you get older, because I know I've experienced it sometimes, but it's like I kind of just wanted to get places on my own merit, like on my Carleton degree, my Loyalist degree, my Algonquin diploma, just being a hard worker, be determined. So in my mind, and it is a point that kind of is a sour point sometimes depending on who you argue with. Sometimes we've had this argument as well, that, to me, it's like, why not look at my resume or interview me and kind of, then determine if I'm right for the job or not. Like it shouldn't come down to if I circle, I'm a person with disability on a paper, or, I have this kind of illness or whatever, like a disability that should kind of put me above everyone else. And in a way, I still kind of feel that way of like, as soon as I put down a person with disability, I'm like, but now you're kind of looking at that as if, oh, he's a person with disability. That's his golden ticket. That's going to get him in through the door. And I'm looking at being like, yeah, but I'm not just walking off the street as a person with disability. I have an educational background to this job I'm applying for or to whatever I'm going to. And I think the real eye opener to me is when I was applying for jobs once I graduated, and I was still kind of hopeful. If I got rejected, I was like, okay, in fairness, I don't have 3 or 5 years experience at this. That's okay. I never really kind of clicked the disability thing because I didn't want to be like a red flag or something that people would label you as. And then over time, I was kind of convinced, whether it be by you or other people that I've met, whether it's a teacher or whoever, they're saying, listen, like, you have to put that down so that it's not just so that you get your foot in the door, but if anything ever happened to you in work, that like they know this, it's not a liability. So I thought, okay, like that's fair to the company to know that I am a person with disability in case anything ever happens. But I wasn't really open to it just because I always just wanted to be a person that 20 years down the road, 30 years, and I know it's kind of sounds egotistical or whatever way, but when people look back, it would just be like a tidbit of an information that like, oh, by the way, did you actually know that he had Sturge Weber? Like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't want that to be the big bio of Bryan Tobin, Sturge Weber syndrome. Oh, and also he's a journalist. It's almost like I want it to be the other way around.
So you didn't want it to become your identity.
Yeah, because like, and in fairness to people that do go places, it's all in how they perceive it. I give a lot of credit to people that do have a disability and make it in media or any industry, and a lot of people just put it as a side note because they've probably worked really hard to not have that be the cover story. There could be people out there now that you don't even know they have the disability, but if someone reminded you, you're like, oh yeah, you know what, I did remember that they had a disability, but they've got so much body of work behind them that it doesn't really affect it, compared to the other way where you hear stories that could be from people that don't like the person or don't like how they got to a career, and they're like, yeah, but that was my biggest thing. It's like, but that's how he got there. But this, like when you hear about nepotism, when people get work, or when you hear about, well, they were buddies, they went to the same school, that's how he got hired. I didn't want that. I wanted to kind of get my foot in the door at whatever company, work your butt off, and if someone questioned you in an interview, or if someone made a nasty comment on Twitter or Facebook, someone would come back instantly. It could be me, could be someone that supports me and says, okay, but here's the background of how he got here, rather than someone pointing out, but he's a person with disability, they hired him because he's a person with disability.
But isn't that a misconception though? I mean, like you had alluded to that, people might think, oh, he hired me because I'm a disability, or that I have a disability, and your disability is non-visible. People, can't see it. And like some people might think, oh yeah, they only got that job because they have a disability. But like one of the things that I've learned as watching you apply for jobs over the years is that that's not really how that program works, right? Like it's that has that been your experience, that you've been hired to jobs because you have a disability?
No, and like that's the whole irony of it, of like, like here I am at 29, and I'm not looking back and saying that's a regret. I stand by what I stand by, and if I don't, I will outright say it. But like at that time, that's how I felt. Like I want to get in a place of work because they like me, they like my body of work, not because I'm a person with disability. But as a bit of a comic side, I like comedy. I can laugh at myself to an extent. It's just funny that I'm like, okay, I'm finally going to give in. I'm finally going to tell the world, hey, I have a disability, and now all these jobs are going to apply. Like they're just going to come at my door and be like, you're a person with disability. Love your work. Love the fact you got a disability. We need people with disability in our work because God, the government is cracking down that we don't hire a lot of disability people. I'm like, foot in the door, great. But I still got my background. But no, it's actually like almost the opposite, where it's like, I don't give a what that you have a disability. You're still not getting in here. And I'm like, but I have a disability. I'm letting you know I have a disability, and I have an education. Like, come on. So yeah, like my experience with that has been no different. So if there are people out there that, whether you put in visible minority, person with disability, and you think, okay, they're going to look at me differently. Yeah, no, they're not. They're going to look at you the same and basically say no or yes. I don't know what their criteria is. I'd love to know it though.
It's funny, and I don't want to portray this interview like this is hopeless.
No,
that
no,
if you have a
exactly.
disability, you shouldn't pursue, right? But what we've learned is, me and you have talked to, I've talked separately, and you've talked to people too, and it seems that the way they apply these principles is, well, if you are exactly the same as someone right down to the last step,
Yeah.
then we'll hire the person with a disability. Whereas my argument has always been that no, I mean, you need to go out with the intention of hiring people with disabilities to improve equity in the workplace, and make them fit that, have the job fit them, as opposed to make them fit the job. Because otherwise, there are certain jobs that you might be qualified for, but because of your disability might impact your ability to do an interview effectively, or might impact that. So as a result, you're not going to be the last two candidates with everything else being equal, because nothing was equal at the beginning. Your disability prevented you from being exactly equal at the beginning, and now they want to say you have to meet all those criteria first. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, like I don't know if it's like a fair comparison. Like I'm kind of a visual person, that if someone gives me like an image or a reference, that's kind of what I relate to. And to me, hearing you say that, or hearing how the experience works, it's almost like, okay, both of you are going to do a 100-meter run or whatever. Like you're going to run around a circle, and you're like, okay, fair. We're both starting at the same starting point. Oh, but by the way, he's starting a little bit further than you, and you're like, okay, a little bit further, not a big deal. But then when you see, by a little bit further, we went this far ahead. Now, if you can catch up to him at that point, you're like, damn, I'm not catching up to him. I don't think that's kind of fair. So that's kind of how I looked at it. Like there are references, and I don't want it to come across as like comparing an apple to an orange, but like I've seen stuff that on social media, on YouTube, on commercials, where they talk about like, when kind of black people go for education and white people go for education, and they show them the line. And I'm not saying that in any offensive way or nothing, but that's kind of how it related to me, is like, here's your line. Okay, now see how far ahead they are compared to you. And I'm like, here I thought we were like playing equal playing field, because I got the same grade, same marks, same experience. But yet, just because they don't put down as disability or anything on their form, that seems like they're a little bit like a light year ahead of you.
Right.
So that's kind of how I felt about it.
So I think that, like, and just so that we're clear on the comparison, you're not suggesting that the challenges that, let's say, African American, African Canadian people have experienced is the same, because obviously it's not.
No, it's just
in terms of a comparison, in terms of being treated differently, in their case through racism, through systematic racism. In your case, because you have there's a bias there that sometimes people don't necessarily see, and because they can't see what the disability is, in terms of visible or non-visible, then you get treated differently. Because even when we talk to some folks about this in the HR world, they don't seem to understand. They really don't seem to understand until you explain to them, well, hold on, you're saying that if he's, you want him to be the same on every factor right up until the end, and then you're going to take him over that other person, when you're forgetting that the disability is preventing him from necessarily being the same on every factor to get to that point, right? Yeah. Okay. So wanted to follow up on this, because I think this is an important accomplishment. Lots of people with Sturge-Weber syndrome never make it to school. They never certainly go to university. I mean, you have a Bachelor of Arts, with a specialty in communications.
Yep, somewhere in that closet, using this time well in that closet. No.
You have a Bachelor of Arts in communications. You have a diploma in sports journalism. From Loyalist College. Your degree is from Carleton University in Ottawa, and you have a degree, a diploma in radio broadcasting from Algonquin College. So you're an educated guy in this field. It's not like you just sort of picked up a microphone and said, I'm doing a podcast. You've got some background here.
Yeah, I think I'm going for the complete sweep. I just need TV and film, like a TV and film degree or diploma, and I got all my media fields covered. Like, communications, PR, radio. I just need that TV. Thinking of going to Vancouver to do their TV and film. I think that's a good opportunity for me.
There you go. So I was, I reviewed your guest list. I've heard lots of your episodes, and what I've heard, they're all great. What's always amazed me is your tenacity to get some of these folks. I mean, if we quickly look at your guest list, I mean, you've interviewed, you talked about Jimmy Rankin, Heather Rankin. From Newfoundland, the Ennis sisters, which are, a wonderful Newfoundland group, friends of mine, great people, fantastic musicians. Mark Critch from Newfoundland, Rick Mercer from Newfoundland. And you got Rick Mercer at the same time that he was announcing that he was hanging up his boots, so to speak, with the Mercer Report. So he was certainly well sought after at the time. You've had like 4 hosts of the National, Rosemary Barton, the former host, I guess now, Rosemary Barton, Ian Hannah-Mansing, Adrian Arsenault, and Andrew Chang. You've had Lisa LaFlamme from CTV, Peter Mansbridge, Wendy Mesley, lots of folks from the news side of things. Then you've had, you've had people like George Strophanopoulos. How do you get these guests? I mean, how do you get them on? Because, these folks are busy, and you're a guy coming out of nowhere. How did you pull this off?
So it's actually kind of an interesting story. I'll try to make it brief, but maybe I'm not the greatest person at making stories brief. It went back to when I remember I was doing at Loyalist College. We had to do internships, and I think I communicated with you that we were on break. We had like a spring break or a fall break, and James Duthie was going at Carleton to do a coin flip. Great, like James Duthie will do anything. He's just that kind of guy. But Nikki, that's the reason you like James Duthie. Can you imagine flying in from Aurora just to do a coin flip or traveling? So I remember sending an email to Carleton because I had a connection with Carleton at the time because I was alumni, and asking them, James Duthie's going to be there. He's supposed to be there to like meet and greet people. Do you mind if I interview him? And they kind of said, no, he's only here to do the coin flip and then he's gone. And I was like, okay. So I went to the event anyway with a microphone in hand, thinking the worst thing he's ever going to say to me is, I don't have the time. I probably wasted a half hour to an hour on a bus traveling, but it's still a football game that, I'm interested in watching, Carleton versus University of Ottawa. So big deal. And I remember asking him, I said, like, James, do you mind? I had a Carleton jacket on. So I was like, I'm a little bit sneaky in the term that I kind of made it look like I was still a part of Carleton. But I said, like, James, do you got like 5 or 10 minutes? I just got a few questions for you. And he said, yeah, sure. I just got to finish up this thing over here and I will come find you. And I'm not like, this is still new. I'm still green per se. So, but I still had this idea that I will come find you, just by the way people say it, is almost like get lost. Like, I will pretend to look for you and somehow not find you. So I kind of made it like, oh, I'm going to just step 2 steps over here so that like he's going to have to notice me. And he immediately came over. We did a 5 or 10 minute interview. And I said to him, like, is it cool if I send you an email? Because I was looking for work. And that's where kind of the wheels started to go in motion, because he's like, oh yeah, it's just James.Duthie at, and I'm not giving it away because people know this stuff anyway, but like, bellmedia.ca. It's on their websites per se, so it's not like it's not secret. But to me, I was just not in the research mindset. So when he said that to me, I was like, so that's James Duthie's email, and they're CTV employees or Bell employees. I wonder if Lisa LaFlamme's email is the same. I wonder if this person's email is the same. Worst case, comes back and says no, like Microsoft Office no, or email got found. And then doing some internships, like, when you send out emails or whatever for jobs and you see the email .cbc or at cbc.ca, at rogers.ca, whatever, you just shoot and hope that the email goes through. And that's essentially what it was. Like, it's not mind breaking knowledge for me at the time. I was like mind blown that you're like Peter.Mansbridge, Wendy.okay. So then when they reply, you're kind of like, am I in trouble? Like, was I not supposed to send an email? And then when they're coming back like, yeah, I'd love to do it. And I'm like, they're going to ask for sample stuff. You have nothing. When they come back and they're like, I guess, down to do the interview, sometimes you're like, okay, is it my backstory that they're interested in because I'm a person with disability? Is it just my area of being involved in media and they want to help someone out? In some cases it is. Rick Campanelli, for example, the funny story is I crossed paths at him when I was with Global, and I was told kind of don't talk to Rick Campanelli. And when I mentioned that to him, he was like, who would tell you that? I'm here to help you guys. Like, there's no way I would ever tell you not to talk to me. And I was like, well, that's more humbling than someone saying don't talk to the main people that you are aspiring to be.
Right, right. So it sounds like, because I remember the story with James Duthie, because I dropped you off at the university that day, and I said, are you gonna try to interview James Duthie? And you said, well, I was told that we're not really supposed to approach these guys. And I dropped you off, and I don't even know if I was off the parking lot, and you texted me a picture of you with James Duthie, arm in arm. And James has been good to you over the years, right? Like James you've interviewed him a couple of times.
Yeah, like, so it was for the first, like that first time was just an encounter that I just thought like, I kind of needed a story at Loyalist too. Now I know Loyalist is kind of looking for local stories in the Belleville area, but I just thought like, I need some sample stuff when I'm done Loyalist, and James Duthie would be a big name, especially if you're in sports, to kind of, even if that interview is kind of just say pretty sketchy or not your best work, because you're probably like, James, nice to meet you. So it's a learning curve, but it's still good to interview these people because you get it under your belt. So I just thought it was like kind of remarkable to do that interview with him, and kind of gone from there. Like, I've reached out to him then, of course, showing him what I've sent him, like showing him this interview, going like, can I use it for sample material? And he's like, absolutely, why not? Like, you don't even have to ask me that. Like, it's clearly your interview. But it was just always in my mindset of ask the person that you interviewed in case there's something in it that they don't want to be repeated. And some people that I've interviewed with podcasting will tell you, no, they agreed to be on your show, like F them, like that's it, they agreed, let them talk. And I'm like, yeah, but there's still a point that you might want them back in the future. So with James, I think that was the first encounter. The second encounter, he had a book, and I had read the book, and like, I'm not a real book person. I'm not going to lie here and be like, oh yeah, look at my bookshelf. Even though when I'm doing podcasting, just say in that room in the back, because that was my spare room, there's a whole bunch of books. They're not mine, so don't ever think they are. But I was just really into the book because it was a sports journalism book about like hockey stories, how he got into his career. And I think that was like, not to, say the other interviews I did weren't great, but this is like the one that you actually dive into their whole career from start to where they are. And I wrote down questions, underlined stuff in that book that I said, if this is going to be my first interview, my last interview I ever do, because at this point I wasn't sure if I wanted to still keep with the podcast, but I just wanted this to be a good sample material. I underlined stuff. I said, I'm going to have to ask him some tough questions about how he got into the career, and not something that you're very comfortable with. But I asked him at the end, like, is this fine to use? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, well, next time you're coming out with a book, or when Christmas comes around, do you mind if I reach out for a shout out? And he said, yes, I might be weeks late. So if anyone ever emails James and he's not easily to reply, he has a life. Obviously, everyone does. So it gives him a few weeks to reply, but he does reply, and he's been good ever since. Like, I haven't had any issues with him of coming back and saying, no, I can't do it. Or if he's ever tight on a deadline, he'll say, Bryan, I've just clued up, like, the trade deadline. We're just cluing into playoffs. Come reach back to me in like June or July when it's a little bit simmered down. But at least he's upfront with you. He's not like, no, I'm not doing that. He's giving you a reason why.
So he's recognized as one of the nice guys in that business, eh? He's not only how he comes across on television, but obviously your experience and others. He's just he just seems to be a really nice man, and of course, really good at what he does. So,
well, and the thing that I kind of want to mention there too, not to cut you off, but just because I don't want it to come across as like always putting over James Duthie, but like through James Duthie in a way, just by his personality, it kind of brings out other people's personality. Like I watch Overdrive, and in fairness, like sometimes I'll think like Jeff O'Neill is just being really hard or like a real mean-spirited person, but then James Duthie will get on and joke with them, and like I know Jeff O'Neill makes fun of him for plugging a book, and James Duthie isn't one to really want to plug a book. It's just that the publicist is telling him, listen, you got to plug this book. So Jeff O'Neill will make fun of it for him, but like just the way that James Duthie handles it is almost like you come across thinking Jeff O'Neill's just carrying on with him compared to actually not liking James Duthie, which it's interesting to me because you'll see other interviews where like, do these guys really don't like each other? Do they hate each other? But I think any interview with James, whether you like him, you don't like him, or you quiz him on something, he still has that approach of like, you come at the end of the interview, you're like, oh, okay, like, geez, he gets it. Like, he's laid back. It's not going to hurt him anyway of saying what you say. He's going to be honest with you. So, yeah, he's like, I think if you were doing a Mount Rushmore of Canadian journalism or sports journalism, he's definitely right up there in terms of just what he offers to people, and then like both on and off camera.
So, I mean, you know, it's funny you're telling the story of getting these guests, and obviously there's been a lot of great acts and a lot of great people on your podcast, you know, to share time with you. But I'm guessing, you know, you have to have a lot of tenacity at that, right? Like you have to be able to ask people and put yourself out there, which you've never had a problem of doing. But then you also have to accept failure, because I'm guessing, you know, you don't have 100% success rate on this. I mean, people do tell you no, or their publicist says no. So like, what do you, like, you're smiling there. Like, I mean, how do you respond to that?
I mean, full disclosure, I mean, there's probably like a 10 or 15 minute window where you kind of want to make sure that all your social media is logged off. No one's like, you know, it's almost like if I had a team around me, they'd be like, Bryan just got to know, don't let him near Twitter, don't let him near Facebook, just make sure he's got nowhere near social media, because it's an instant reaction that's like, you know, you, in my mind, and, you know, people will kind of taunt you or tease you with you because, you know, I've had classmates that would do it. Like, for example, you interviewing James Duthie, there was classmates that would say, you seem really relaxed. Like, what are you, like, oh, you think you're better than us? And I'm just like, no, like, I'm just interviewing a person. That's it. Like, I get where you could get a little bit kind of like high strung or like, oh my God, panic attack. But I'm like, at the end of the day, they're a person that's done well. So when I send out emails,
but they're just a person.
Yeah, like
they're no better than you either.
Yeah, like, so it's just like when you do get rejection emails, that's the catch-22 of it all. When you get them on your show and people are like, for example, you or anyone, when you're like, oh, that's so great, you got Rick Mercer on. I'm not going around a kitchen going, Rick Mercer. I'm going around like, great, I've got another interview. I got to go research some stuff and make sure it sounds okay. And at the same point, when you get a no, that's where the kind of the catch-22 of it comes is, you know, if you said to someone, listen, I tried to get Ryan Reynolds or Will Smith on a podcast and they said no, people are like, oh my God, yeah, of course they're going to say no to you. Look at you. And you're thinking, yeah, it's Will Smith. It's just a person. Why doesn't he have 10 minutes for me? And it's like, yeah, but he's Will freaking Smith. And you're like, I hear you. I feel like we're talking on the same level, but it's still a person. And then they walk away from you. You're like, I don't understand why he's so mad. He's just a person. But,
so you don't view these, and this comes across in your interviews, which is really quite a skill. You just view these people as, hey, I'm just having a conversation with whoever.
Yeah.
Whoever's on your show, right? I mean, was that what it was like for you? Like, let me use the example of someone like, okay, William Daniels.
Yeah.
I mean, William Daniels, I mean, I know the reason you interviewed him, you were a big fan of Boy Meets World, and Mr. Daniels played Mr. Feeney on Boy Meets World, but he's a famous Hollywood actor. He was known for Knight Rider. He played the voice of Kid in Knight Rider, and he was on, I believe, St. Elsewhere, right?
Yeah, he was a doctor.
St. Elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is a hero to you. You get him on the phone in LA, and like, were you nervous about that at all when you interviewed someone like him?
And I think that's kind of the irony, or like, you know, the backtrack of my statement too, is kind of like, you know, in that sense, like to some of these people, like, yeah, I watched Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, like I watched James Duthie daily, but it was never to the point, like, you know, that as much as I idolized them, it's not something that I kind of grew up on. It's like I idolized them because, you know, I liked Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but there's a whole bunch of reasons why I like Fresh Prince. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I like TSN, and James Duthie is a reason. But like, with Mr. Daniels, like even calling him Mr. Daniels, because I've been told you don't call him Bill or William. It is Mr. Daniels, which fair enough. He is an elder, and it just goes to show you that I kind of respect him in that way.
Very well respected man. Yeah. Go ahead.
But like, I laugh at it because I remember there's such a time difference between LA and, you know, Ottawa, as people know, but he wasn't available like till 10:30 that night, and you're in school from say 9 to 5. You want to get home, and I remember getting home for maybe 10 minutes to take out the dog that's somewhere in the background there, like TJ, and immediately in my mind, like you have these moments to yourself. You're like, God, like I'm here 10 minutes now. I got to go get an hour bus back here just to interview William Daniels. Why don't I have a setup at home? But like when you get there, you've got it prepped, you're ready. And then you're thinking all the situations that I guess in a way could go wrong. He might not be ready. So in my mind, I was still waiting for that last second of, sorry, wrong day, or sorry, he's not available, or he didn't know what he signed up for. But when I actually got him on the phone, his wife, who was actually in Boy Meets World as well, I think she was like Dean Bolander, and she was also in St. Elsewhere. She picked up the phone. And again, me being clueless, maybe it's just because I'm a 90s kid, don't know the whole background of them prior to Boy Meets World. I didn't know till after the phone call that was who it was. So, you know, she was helping him out with the questions, and I was kind of blown away because he was very relaxed, very chummy. But yeah, there was a few points that I'm like, oh, great. All this exterior that you're like a tough interviewer or just down to earth. When it comes down to Mr. Feeney, like in your mind, it's still Mr. Feeney on the other end of the phone going, how are you today, Bryan? Because that was the first thing he said. I'm like, Mr. Feeney just said, how am I today, Bryan? I feel like Corey Matthews. Oh my God, my questions just went out the window. Where do I go from here? So yeah, but once you get it around, it was a very relaxing, fun interview.
So you were, you know, admittingly you were a little bit starstruck by Mr. Daniels in his interview.
Yeah, like, and you gotta look at it from the standpoint of, I was so used to getting Canadian acts, and like, again, no offense to these Canadian acts, like, you know, it's a Canadian podcast, so you're kind of, again, maybe this is the mindset that people will be like, geez, he's very egotistical about it, but like, I'm a Canadian act going for Canadian people. That shouldn't be too tough. Yes, you're gonna get no's from some of these acts. Like, we haven't had Ryan Reynolds on, obviously. It'd be great to have him. He's a Canadian act, but like, this was, I guess, my first American act that we've had on. I could be wrong. Maybe it was like number second or third, but in my mind, it was like, Boy Meets World is my all-time favorite show. I grew up with Mr. Feeney quotes of like, you know, I could riddle stuff off, or like, I just thought when you get older, these things, as a kid, you're watching it for Corey and Sean, but as you get older, you're watching it for like the metaphors, like, you know, if Corey and Sean had a break or a fight and you go see your neighbor across the fence, like, that's not real life. You don't bugger your neighbor about this stuff. But he'd have like a piece of paper and he'd be saying, friendship is like this. And it's like a kind of like I don't know what kind of piece of paper. He tried to tear it and you can't, but he's like, the slightest tear, the slightest argument. And it like ripped. And you're like, that's mind-blowing stuff, Mr. Feeney.
That's deep.
So when you get him on the podcast and he's giving you these kind of life lessons to yourself, like not outright because he wants to, but you take him that way, you're like, I'm getting taught by someone that like I wanted to be taught by. This is great.
So, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention who his wife actually is. So his wife is, her name is Bonnie Bartlett. And you're right, she was in episodes of St. Elsewhere. She was in she was actually in recently Better Call Saul, most recently, which is a great show as well. She's been in a ton of stuff herself. And by the way, if you don't remember, because you probably wouldn't, you know, I'm a huge fan of the Golden Girls. She was actually in an episode of the Golden Girls, played kind of an evil character, but shout out to Miss Bartlett as well. So both of those folks are in LA and doing well. So I have to ask you, because we're getting near to the end of our time here, and I know you're a busy guy yourself. Who's your favorite guest been? Of all the guests you've had, who would you say your favorite guest was to interview?
It's such like, it's going to come across like a political answer, which I don't want to come across that way because I'm not a political person. It's kind of tough because I'm not going to say like, oh, each one of the 99 or the 98, like, oh, they're all great. Obviously that's true, but you do have ones that stick out. Now, I don't really have a kind of all-time favorite because in each interview, I'm sure there are times I'm like, I could have done that a little bit better. I could have edited that a bit better. You know, there's no one that's 100% that you're going there like, I can sit down, listen to that and not have any kind of criticism. But there's like 2 or 3 that I like for particular areas or particular reasons. Like Jimmy Rankin's obviously going to be one of my favorites just because he was the first one to really start it. They could have easily came back and said, are you kidding me? You got nothing. Like, why am I giving you Jimmy Rankin? The other one would be James Duthie, just because, again, getting to meet him face to face and then, you know, just reaching out to him. And again, like most times you would start at the lower pole of just say anywhere. And like, again, I'm not saying that these people are lower, but maybe they would agree to. But if you went to TSN and said, I would like to interview the person behind the camera that does James Duthie's work or the writer of James Duthie, and then you work your way up from there. But to actually get the head of kind of TSN, the face of TSN right off the bat, like that's kind of like, okay, I've reached the pinnacle for TSN. So now everyone else that I get are equally as great, but it's like, I've got the face of TSN. So if I can send them this saying, well, James Duthie was on the podcast, sending that to a Jay Onrait or a Lindsay Hamilton, they're like, well, if James did his show, I don't see why I can't do his show. I'm going to be on the same level playing field. So those would be the top 2. And I'm not saying 1 and 2, like 1 and 2, you could either arrange it different ways. And I think the third one would just be, William Daniels, just because at the time, again, grew up with Boy Meets World, one of my favorite shows, and to really get anyone on. Like we've reached out to the other actors as well. They're sometimes busy, you just can't get them. It's whatever. But for him to come on, I was like, okay, so I've got Mr. Feeney at like 11 o'clock tonight. Let's go. But let's see if we can make this sound good. And there are definitely times that, like I said, it's one that I think I was a little bit more nervous for, but when you get into it a little bit more, you start to grasp, like, I'm the interviewer here. Like, you know, if you want this to make it sound good, you might only get them once. So let's, you know, you got like 2 people on your shoulder, like one like, this is Mr. Feeney. Yes, like, don't worry about it. You can totally choke in this interview. And then you got another one like, what are you doing? You're getting them for one time. Don't choke. Like, bring it back. And you're like, I got to. Okay, let's do this.
Fair enough. So it sounds like those 3 folks certainly have been memorable for you personally.
Yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about Newfoundland, because, you know, for people that are listening, you're from Newfoundland and Labrador, which is east coast of Canada, and so, you know, there's a certain culture there in Newfoundland, and you talk often when you post on the website or on your website, or, you know, you introduce yourself, even when you put in your cover letter in for applying for jobs, you talk about being a proud Newfoundlander. What does that mean for you, and how does that impact your show, do you think?
I think, like, to me, there's a number of reasons why I probably put it in like a resume, or even when I do it on a podcast. I don't think I name drop it too much. If I do, it's probably just because of the way the conversation's going, because we're probably talking about Canada, or, you know, someone's talking about growing up in Bradford or Brampton compared to, and then I bring up about growing up in Newfoundland. But I think a big reason I do it is because, and it could just be in your own mindset, I'm not saying that sways anyone's opinion, but like if you're going for a CBC job per se, and you're pitching your podcast to CBC, or you're pitching a show or applying for a job, I think Tom Power had said it, and I think George Stropolopoulos mentioned it as well. Like, I asked Tom Power at one point, do you think Newfoundlanders are like kind of not getting the cut, or like, you know, we're not getting respect as much? And he's like, I think we're well tapped. Like, we're well tapped. And I was like, he's got a point. There's Tom Power. There's Rick Mercer. This hour's 22 minutes might be filmed in Halifax, but that's a whole bunch of Newfoundlanders on that. It just, to me, it's like, it's almost like in itself a little bubble that if you can make it across off this island, and then seeing people not just doing okay, like in the media, but like being very successful. It's not like Rick Mercer or an Alan Doyle, even in music, just came out of the province and like, okay, you're doing okay. Like, I know who you are. Like, no, you talk to Canadians and they know who Alan Doyle is because of Great Big Sea or himself. So it's kind of like a bit of a pride thing of when you say you're a Newfoundlander, it's almost like you're betting on yourself But for someone who might be looking at Newfoundland and going like, well, look at all the talents coming out of Newfoundland. This fellow's from Newfoundland. He could be the next wave of people that we could use to get places. And I know that sounds egotistical, and I know it sounds far-fetched, but that's the way I kind of look at it. Is like, you know, Rick Mercer and them they've done like they're pretty much retired, semi-retired. They've made their money, they've made their wealth, they're doing okay. But it's like, okay, so what's next? Like, who's the next wave of people coming out of Newfoundland that we can say, or we can claim to be proud of? So that's kind of one aspect of it. The other reason I do it is just because when you're asking people that are particularly Canadian acts, when you say you're a Newfoundlander, I feel like it's like a little bit of a weight lifted off their shoulder, because if you get the stereotype, whether it's right or wrong, of a Newfoundlander being very friendly, very open, very like nonchalant to an interviewer, like if someone came across to me tomorrow and I'm in Ottawa and they don't know I'm from a Newfoundland and they said, listen, we got two fellas from Newfoundland, I want to interview you, I'd be like, geez, yeah, they gotta be laid back, they gotta be relaxed. Sure, I'd love to do it. Compared to, and no offense, but if someone said, I got a fella from Boston that's gonna interview you, I'd be like, okay, I don't know. They could be very friendly, but just that image in your mind of being Boston, being kind of rough, tough, like, who you think you are? And you're just like, I think you asked me to come on your podcast. I don't think it's supposed to be mean, but that's just my interpretation of when you hear Newfoundland, you hear friendly.
That's your stereotype of people from Boston who we hope aren't listening.
Yeah, but it's like, you know, in fairness, Conan has, like, I'm a big fan of Conan, and Conan even says it, and it's funny to me that Conan brings it up, like, in one of these late nights. They said, when you go back to Boston, and it kind of counterpoints mine, but it's like, they don't care who you are. It's like, hey, you think you're better than me? Don't skip the line. Get in the back of the line. It's like, this is Conan O'Brien you're talking to. Like, but he's like, okay, fair enough. Like, he's basically telling you, because I remember the story, he's like, before you even get a chance to tell them I'm Conan O'Brien, they're already bringing you down a peg. Like, as soon as they see you, you might be going to the back of the line anyway, but four of them already tell you, hey, you think you're better than me? Go to the back of the line. It's like, I was going there anyway, but it's just for them to say it, to get it out of their system. So I feel like when someone hears Newfoundland, it's like, okay, friendliness. They think just down to earth, like hospitality. And that's just my perception. Now, there could be people out there that say, Bryan, you're dead wrong. Like, I'll do a podcast with anyone, anywhere. And then that's fair. It's just my perception that if you write Newfoundland, especially for Canadian acts, that they could be from Nova Scotia, or starting off, again, they were from Nova Scotia, they were East Coast. They'd say, oh, I'm only doing an East Coast podcast. That's great. It's still local, somewhat in the Atlantic provinces. And then as it just got bigger, I just said, like, no, it wouldn't hurt to just put in the Newfoundland bit, just in case there are acts out there or people out there that, even if they're on the podcast, like I think it was Dan O'Toole had mentioned. Now, he mentioned, because when he was out west, he had worked with a whole bunch of Newfoundlanders. Now, if I didn't mention I was a Newfoundlander in the bio, he probably wouldn't have brought up the story about meeting Newfoundlanders and how friendly they are. So I think it's a little bit of, I guess, not tourism, but just good, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, good PR sometimes for Newfoundland when you get a guest on and they give a shout out to Newfoundland. Like Dean Brody put over Newfoundland in his interview of saying, I love Signal Hill. I can't wait to come back. And I don't think they'd mention that stuff if you don't say you're from Newfoundland.
Right. So what is the guest that you most wanted in the first 100 that you couldn't get?
I mean, it's a pretty obvious, I mean, I've got the room decorated for Christmas stuff now, but I mean, I used to have a few bobbleheads and Funko Pops in the back. Like, I think number one, and I remember saying this to my friends, and again, I thought it was going to be so easy to get them. It was Conan. I wanted Conan for like episode 1 to episode 50. And I know, like, I reach out to his PR and they just come back and say, he's busy, he doesn't have the time. And like, again, coming back to the whole social media side of things, or where you want to kind of lock yourself in a room for like 10 minutes. It's like, there are weeks that Conan's not doing TV. There's weeks that he's on break. And I'm like, are you? And then I'd come back to like the PR people, which to their credit, they probably look at me and say like, oh, he's just a little bit mad because he got no. But I'd be coming back to them and saying like, so you're telling me he's off for 3 weeks and he's got no time for a 20-minute interview? And they'd be like, that's pretty much what I'm saying. And I'm like, mind blown. He's a person. Again, coming back to, he's just a person who doesn't have 20 minutes. And then someone else would look at you and be like, Bryan, he's Conan O'Brien. He's not Conan down the street. Like, it's same thing. Apple.
But could Conan be busy in his 3 weeks off? Like, could he have other things to do?
He could. In my side, in my like kind of mindset, I'm like, he's not doing a show for 3 weeks. Wouldn't it be kind of cool to have him on to be interviewed? But yeah, you're right. Those 3 weeks are probably him saying, I'm done with interviews. I want 3 weeks to relax. And now you're telling me this kid from Newfoundland wants to interview me? Like, no, what are you not understanding? And it's like the same with John Oliver. John Oliver takes like, 2 or 3 months off sometimes between doing Last Week Tonight, and the same thing. And then you're thinking to yourself like, okay, so what are you doing in the 2 or 3 months? Like, I feel like, in the vice versa, I think he was doing a promo one time when HBO was coming back, and it was Curb Your Enthusiasm was also coming back. And they had Larry David on, and, he was just making jokes of all these shows that were coming back to HBO, and John Oliver would somehow be in the shot. And Larry David says to him, like, yeah, what, you thought they were talking about you? No, we're coming back. He's like, and then he says to Larry, like, yeah, but what have you been doing for 2 or 3 months? He's like, I've been busy. Like, I've been busy. Like, leave me alone. And that's where I kind of felt like I was the John Oliver to John Oliver. Like, yeah, what are you doing for 2 or 3 months? Like, what are you saying? You can't do 20 minutes? It's like, I've been busy. Yeah, what are you busy at? It's like, none of your business.
So the next, so your 100th episode is coming up this week. I'm told again, I know Christmas is your absolute favorite time of year, and it's another Christmas themed episode, which is great. I don't want to give anything away. Tell me about the next 100. What are you going to do? What's in store for the next 100 episodes?
Oh no, we're done. Once we hit 100, we're done.
Once you hit 100, that's it. You're out.
It's basically my Disney project, where it's like you reach 100 episodes. I've heard this, and it could be wrong, but it's like once Disney hits 100 episodes of anything, they're like, all right, that was a success. Let's do something else. So that's my approach. No, I've got a few guests lined up, hopefully now for the new year. Like, I find this in its own kind of extreme, a bit of a learning curve for myself. Like, I've been on internships and they haven't panned out great. So this is kind of my own way of self-learning. I believe you fail until you succeed, as long as people are willing to adapt to that as well. So there have been times that you'll reach out to people and they'll tell you no. You get in a little bit of a tiff with them, but you somehow figure it out. So like acts that I kind of hope on for the next 100. I think we've had, I hope I don't screw up the name, like Hal Johnson from Body Break.
Yeah, Body Break.
By saying Body Break, I immediately have to go, Body Break. So we have him on, hopefully. We've got Neon Dreams, another, East Coast band.
Yeah.
I think what was the other, like they're the few, DDP and Jake Roberts are supposed to, so for people that are involved with wrestling.
Simon Dallas Page and Jake the Snake Roberts.
Yeah.
So that'll be great.
Yeah, like, so those are like, they're not confirmed, but they're in the works. Like, it's a little bit more promising than saying no. Like, they could be in February, March, April, somewhere down the road. It could be even June, July, but at least they're in the works to supposed to be on. But I kind of like that because it's a little bit of a, to me anyway, when you're doing another 100, you're kind of going back to your roots in the sense of, having a few more East Coast acts on to prove like, yeah, we may be getting bigger than what we used to be, just this little East Coast project, but it's still nice to have a Neon Dreams on that have done well, that are from the East Coast and have their own interesting story. It's still nice to have on, as a person who grew up watching wrestling, to not just seem like, oh, I'm embarrassed to have these people on because I'm older now. Like, no, embrace it. Embrace that you were a wrestling fan.
Wrestling's cool. I'm still a wrestling fan.
Yeah.
I like some of the old stuff, but I'm still a wrestling fan. And these interviews are great. I mean, I know you recently had Vicky Guerrero on the podcast. So, excellent. I'm happy to see more wrestlers come on.
And look, and I think, like, not to cut you off there, but I think that the key aspect sometimes too is, we both grew up watching wrestling. So when you're younger, you want, and not saying that I haven't, I reached out to Austin, reached out to Rock, but they're, you know where they're too. But like, when you're younger, that's who you want. Even when you're going into stores, you don't want a Vicky Guerrero doll when you're 5 or 6. You don't want like Chavo Guerrero. Maybe you do if you like him. But to me, it was give me the top stars. But as you get older, you kind of appreciate their ground of work. Like if I try to interview Vicky Guerrero at 16, I'd be sitting here in a chair going, oh, okay, I got Vicky Guerrero on. But now as 29, just seeing the experience she's gone through, like if someone told me again with Jake the Snake Roberts, DDP, whoever, you could ask me for Chavo, and I would sit here going over the moon going, great, we have this guy on. I'm so interested because, yeah, he wasn't like the top guy, but that makes it more interesting because he's been around for this long and he's had great matches in between. Or in Vicky's case, you know, she's bounced from WWE to AEW, but still relevant. And I think as you get older, you appreciate that stuff a little bit more than a kid who's like, just give him a stunner and get out of the ring. Like, no, I want to hear more.
And they're great. And at the end of the day, they're great stories, right? Yeah. I mean, all of these folks, I mean, Vicky came on the podcast and has great stories to tell about her life and experience. And I have no doubt that Jake Roberts and DDP and all the others that you will interview and that you have interviewed, they all have great stories to tell. And you know what? I respect and appreciate your ability to do it because not everyone can. And I think it's probably a good place to clue it up. But I will say, thank you for having me on the podcast. If no other reason than to throw questions at you, I've enjoyed it, and hopefully you will have me back for episode 199. I know this is the Wayne Gretzky episode of the podcast, but maybe you'll have me back again for 199 as you prepare for 200. But I do want to say, from my perspective as a brother, very proud of you. Great job in getting to 100. Great job on the interviews and the guests. And I know all the work and energy you put into this. So great job. Congratulations. And look forward to the next 100.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try to ruin this sentimental moment here, but it's like when
I think you are, though. I think that's exactly
I will, because when you said 199, the only way you'd probably get bumped is if Wayne Gretzky himself said, "I know you're coming up on 200, but 99, kind of my thing." I'm like, it's 199, Gretzky. He'd be like, even better.
You know what? I am prepared to take that chance.
Yeah, you'll have to do a Zoom chat and be like, listen, Wayne, it's not between me and you anymore. You got to talk to this fella. He's a little bit upset that he doesn't get to be on. He'd be like, are you serious right now? It's between me and your brother. And I'd be like, Wayne, I still don't understand what side you want me to choose. What are you trying to say? Family first or guest first? Yeah. Oh, Wayne, are you gone? How come you're not in the Zoom chat anymore?
I'm sure Wayne will have been gone by that point. Absolutely. Thanks so much for allowing this to happen, for this interview to take place, and I look forward to listening to 100 coming days.
That's going to do it for this episode of Tobin Tonight. Remember, you can find past, present, and future episodes on TobinTonight.com, Spotify, and iTunes. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and leave a comment or two. For Tobin and myself, this is Jacob saying thank you for listening, and good night.